Metaphor is everywhere. We are surrounded in our every waking moment, and even sometimes in our dreams. As humans, we average around 6 metaphors for every minute of conversation that we hold, and our spoken language has evolved to include metaphor to such an integral extent that when presented with certain metaphorical statements, we are now unable to identify whether some metaphors are wholly accurate or if they are in fact, literally, a lie. Could this be a reason for the widespread use of metaphorical imagery in our everyday existence, from television adverts tempting us to consume, through to everyday social interactions, and that its usage, particularly within the visual arts, to bring deeper meaning to a piece of work has been so universally adopted? This thesis will aim to address this question amongst others, leading to a comment upon how artists have used metaphor to challenge authority. The presentation will be approached using a 2-part format. The first part will address the way in which we understand metaphor from a semiotic and cognitive perspective, linking the scientific evidence to the creative through examples of artistic movements and their underpinning theories. This section will explore our comprehension of metaphor and how the cognitive processes involved in the translation of such language can affect the physical body, creating a powerful emotional response that literal statements simply do not evoke. Culminating in a comment upon the many ways visual metaphor is used daily in an attempt to alter certain thought patterns and shape behaviour. The second section will investigate certain individuals and pieces of work representing different creative fields that have used visual metaphor to challenge cultural norms and political ideals, in some cases resulting in the arrest, brutalization, and imprisonment of the artist. Broader ethical questions will be exposed regarding the censorship of artists and the fear of expression that is inherent within certain cultures in our society today, connecting the 2 parts in a concluding statement using all of the information gained throughout. In our world, the language that is used by humans to communicate with one another is a multifaceted interaction, utilizing cognitive as well as physical dimensions. We use our eyes to perceive any slight changes or twitches of facial muscles, and our arms and hands to emphasize the tone or meaning of what is being said. The use of metaphor within the vocal sphere of contact is just as complex. For some, metaphor is a device used only for the poetic or rhetorical imagination, seen purely as a matter of words rather than a way of thought. However, when we look a little more closely at what defines a metaphor, we see that we are in fact surrounded, even down to the everyday constructs governing our thoughts. Aristotle's definition of metaphor is the process by which we give something the label or name that in actuality belongs to something else. A good example of this technique being employed is the contemporary English phrase "time is money." Corresponding to the fact that we act as if time is a valuable commodity, a limited resource, even money, we conceive of time that way. Thus we understand and experience time as the kind of thing that can be spent, wasted, budgeted, invested wisely or poorly, saved or squandered. Within normal speech, metaphor usage is so unconscious that when subjects in a recent study were given a series of metaphorical sentences to analyze, many were unable to identify within the specified time limit whether such phrases as "my job is a jail" or "many surgeons are butchers" were literally false. The predecessor to this study, known as the Stroop test, had already ascertained through rigorous testing that humans are fundamentally unable to ignore literal meanings, leading to the conclusion that metaphor has become so ingrained into our speech that we subconsciously experience a cognitive dissonance or confusion when faced with these tests, therefore making the same connections in our reasoning as when we are reading or hearing something that is literally true. However, in order for a metaphor to be successful, there must be a sharing of common properties that should, in some sense, be relevant to the metaphorical claim. A metaphor should also unify characteristics that are mildly incongruous or initially nonsensical to the reader or viewer. According to Davidson, a metaphor needs to be unbelievable in order to provoke the viewer to subconsciously search for an alternative meaning. but with an element of truth, albeit sometimes tenuous, and not so nonsensical that we are unable to make the necessary cognitive jumps to be able to connect the source and target. Otherwise it becomes incomprehensible. Geary states that whenever we encounter an abstract idea, emotion, feeling or concept, it is expected that we resort to metaphor in order to understand it. By using Aristotle's rule of giving one thing the name of another, we give the original word an entirely new network of meanings and analogies, creating patterns and sparking recognition between the source and target term. Taking what we already comprehend about the metaphor's source, we combine and juxtapose it with what we know about the metaphor's target, thus giving the audience a more intense understanding of the source than if it were to be described literally, and creating a visceral, synesthesic relationship between meanings, very much like the examples of coloured hearing as studied by Geliev in 2005. This leads to 3 distinct processes for the creation and recognition of metaphor: cognitive dissonance, pattern recognition, and conceptual synesthesia. In this respect, it would seem that the scientific approach overlaps the artistic, using much the same methodology as in postmodernism, as the viewer is required to assemble the meaning of a work through being presented with dualistic imagery to be deconstructed and recreated on another level, using similar cognitive processes as in linguistic metaphor translation, but with certain subtle differences. The surrealists have been cited as being the masters of metaphor, often giving a piece of work multiple metaphorical interpretations and using the initially nonsensical connections between source and target as a cause for humour, this leading eventually into the realms of the avant-garde, where everything is comparable to everything else. Everything finds an echo and a resemblance. It contains both resemblances and oppositions and illustrates what Baudelaire called the logic of the absurd. This directly conflicting with Davidson's criterion for what constitutes a successful metaphor, and allowing for a more subjective, image-based interpretation of meanings, something that Davidson, whose study is predominantly on linguistic metaphor, seems to have overlooked. It is not only paintings that explore metaphor and our understanding of it. The Situationist movement, rising out of 1960s Berlin, became a doorway for avant-garde artists and actors to work together, using the medium of metaphor to express anti-authoritarian views, working from a more physical platform, where synesthetic connections are stimulated using various costumes and hairstyles in order to disrupt certain ceremonies and political rallies. If surrealism can find metaphorical meaning everywhere, and the Situationists even use their physical presence metaphorically, it seems that knowledge of metaphor and our unconscious tendency to see truth within it could be a powerful tool to have within any arsenal where persuasion is the target. When using metaphor, it is not only the words or images being employed that allow for understanding of the message, but also a host of subconscious cognitive reasoning that takes the viewer from the initial seeing or hearing of the metaphor through making the necessary associations that lead to the final interpretation. Because conceptual synesthesia is one of these necessary steps, when metaphor is encountered, the human mind automatically searches for recognition of what is known in order to construct the connections between source and target domains. Here, an identification with the reality that is being presented, taken from the reality that is familiar, occurs, generating an empathetic connection, leaving an impact far deeper than that of purely literal language. Due to the fact that we interpret our world mostly through metaphor, and that since our infancy metaphorical concepts have been firmly embedded into our minds, if we think of a primary metaphor, for example, warmth is affection, we can usually make the connection between being held as a child and feeling loved. One can only conclude that the use of metaphor can generate non-conscious behavioral and neurally entrenched cognitive responses within us. When an artist produces a piece of work, he or she is creating an image from a mental concept using elaborate contextual systems consisting of colour, form and texture, amongst others, that need to be mentally translated without the aid of syntactic or grammatical rules that govern linguistic metaphor, using only an innate awareness of the synesthetic corresponding emotions that can arise from viewing a well-constructed visual metaphor. 20th century philosopher Susanne Langer believed strongly in the artist's fundamental knowledge of this connection, and stated that art expresses life, feeling, growth, movement, emotion, and everything that characterizes vital existence. Some things in our experience cannot be expressed through grammatical structures such as those found in language. They require some other symbolism if we are to understand them. Could metaphor be the reason for our love of plays, movies, and visual imagery? Research has indeed shown that humans interact with visual stimulus viscerally, recognizing a story's hero or heroine's reality as their own through the artist's expressions of life, thus stimulating our natural behavioral responses to the plotline. In the 1990s, a discussion took place regarding the possibility of the private ownership of certain land. Those in opposition of this decision used the following argument: "Our land feeds us, it gives us life, it is our mother, and a mother may not be sold." Here we see clearly how an emotional response has been evoked. How better to create impactful reasoning than by giving one object, the land, the qualities of something that almost every human child holds the most dear, the mother. According to Kvexes, this anthropomorphism of an object metaphor is used most predominantly in advertisements, creating a synesthetic reaction by presenting inanimate objects such as cars as sexualized reciprocal beings, or by depicting household items like washing powder becoming a friend. Even in animated stories, metaphor is used in a didactic manner, attempting to teach viewers moralistic values or to alert audiences to such issues as bullying, project funding, or global conservation. Animation is an especially successful conduit for such educational methods, as it is not restricted by the physical limitations of actors, nor does it need to adhere to any sort of traditional narrative. Within the animated, or as is becoming increasingly utilized, the CGI world, any experience can be made palpable, and the use of imaginative imagery, metaphor, and creative sound stimulates our empathetic responses. Research suggests that this method of delivery also aids in retention, as when one is presented with animation coupled with narration, the viewer can store that information into the memory without the need to mentally create the absent part. However, when we see how ingenuous we, the population, are as a whole to metaphoric stimulus, this teaching methodology becomes slightly more insidious. Not only are we susceptible to tangible, metaphoric embodied meaning, for example, showing participants an illuminated light bulb before asking them to complete a creative task affected the outcome significantly, but even subliminal exposure to metaphor, a cartoon image of a light bulb, has also been shown to dramatically impact one's perception. The ramifications of this discovery in the age of the smartphone, internet, and instant consumerism are potentially quite alarming. In late 2003, a slightly unkempt young man ambled into the Tate Britain carrying a large paper bag. He walked past the security guards, making his way to an unattended upstairs room, and glued his own painting on the wall. The title, "Crime Watch UK Has Ruined the Countryside for All of Us," and was Banksy's primary guerrilla exhibition in the UK. Over the next few months, Banksy used this tactic to hang his own paintings in museums and galleries throughout the UK and United States, once claiming that an image lasted 8 days before being removed by staff and ensuring his rise to fame as a quality vandal. Banksy's criticism was aimed at the seemingly unfair entry criteria used for the selection of artwork and the lack of influence the viewing public has on what is displayed as art, stating in a later interview, "These galleries are just trophy cabinets for a handful of millionaires." The content of Banksy's artwork is rich with metaphor and invites the viewer to question many aspects of society, including the reasons given to the public for acts of war, consumerism, and conservation. With these examples in mind, much of his artwork can be placed into the contextual metaphor category, where an object is metamorphized due to the visual context within which it has been placed. This is a rather more structuralist view of metaphor and could also play a part in the understanding of it, due to the fact that where we see the metaphor is paramount to our perception of the meaning given to it. Banksy predominantly uses outdoor spaces as his canvas, linking his art to what already exists in that space and adding to the ability to categorize his work as contextual. Using the medium of a different type of metaphor, Athena Farghadani depicted members of the Iranian government with the heads of various animals in protest to a new bill seeking to criminalize voluntary sterilization and restricting access to family planning and contraception in Iran. Her method of metaphoric delivery can be distinguished as a hybrid metaphor, whereby two objects are merged on a physical level representing a single gestalt. Chinese artist Ai Weiwei has another approach to challenging authority, using a subtype of pictorial metaphor known as integrated metaphor. This being characterized by an object appearing in its entirety but made to resemble something completely different. His snake ceiling is a good example of this use of metaphor. This piece was a response to the deaths of thousands of school children due to poorly constructed government buildings when an earthquake hit the Sichuan province in 2008, and goes beyond the standard source-target schema, undertaking a noticeably more surrealist course, incorporating multi-leveled layers of metaphor to be reconstructed. Remaining in China, we see how the Gao brothers' use of metaphor is again slightly different. Many of their works challenge the authority of the People's Republic of China by depicting dictator Mao Zedong as various distortions and incongruous forms. The Gao brothers' use of metaphor is multifaceted and grotesquely parodies a number of Eastern and Western ideologies. Some of these pieces can be categorized as having a multimodal metaphoric meaning. According to Gibbs, this type of metaphor has three distinct qualities and is often used in moving imagery. The two objects must belong to two different categories. They can be identified as target and source in a definite A is B format that invites the viewer to map the connections between them. And more than one sensory mode or sign system is employed in order to hint at the metaphor. These contemporary artists have all suffered for their art. Military forces shutting down exhibitions and raiding or destroying studios have terrorized some. Others have been kidnapped, disappearing in the night and being held against their will for months at a time. In the worst cases, being imprisoned, brutalized, and sentenced to many years behind bars. But what of animation? Surely if metaphor delivery is more effective when using visual and narrative techniques employed together, animators must also have used their art in order to address certain socio-political themes. Using the multimodal example, we can begin to look at animations that have predominantly included metaphor to challenge authority. Coonskin is a Ralph Bakshi film stated as being too daring and controversial for its time, and was released in 1975 amid much protesting from black and white communities alike. Bakshi, having lied to his investors in order to make the movie, attempted to expose the racism and fetishistic inclination of American imagination so predominant throughout animation at the time. The movie is a critique on America's New South ideal, where white supremacy rules. Indeed, as a stand against this ideology, Miss America is featured metaphorically throughout the movie as a buxom, freckled and seductive figure, preventing the uprising of black rebellion using both direct and surreptitious methods. Here we see how the use of the Miss America icon as oppressor has been turned into a multimodal metaphor simply by creating a stars and stripes clad femme fatale who alternately seduces and violently murders her black lovers, the combination of visual and auditory modes allowing the viewer to make the necessary cognitive links without difficulty. The Hand, released in 1965 by Jiri Trinka, uses a large gloved hand as its primary oppressive symbol, and creates the metaphor through the relationship between ruling body and artist. Dressed as a harlequin, a token of the working man at that time in Eastern Europe, the little character repeatedly fends off enforced creative servitude, eventually succumbing and ironically being given a full state funeral. Sensory stimulants are used throughout the film that add to the multimodal theme. unseen heavy footsteps outside the door, juxtaposed with the Harlequin's lively athletic movements and tinkling music, being just one example. Trinker initially had no problems releasing the film, as he was already the USSR's most prominent animator. However, after his death in 1969, government policy was revised and his animation was banned from being displayed publicly. Only in 1993, when the Soviet Union fell, was the hand once again placed into circulation. The 1989 short animation Balance by the Lauenstein brothers explores a broader argument, inviting more interpretation than the previous two examples, but leaving unanswerable questions at the same time. Several figures are balanced upon a large platform, needing cooperation between them all to stay horizontal. At the appearance of a heavy box that seemingly plays music, a skirmish ensues for ownership of the mysterious item, leading to the irresolvable situation of one lone figure trapped on one side of the platform, with the box counterbalancing his weight on the other. The metaphor seemingly points to the platform being Western society, and the puppets, balanced precariously upon it, participating in a quasi-capitalist structure, the box itself appearing to be a symbol for material wealth. However, Wells surmises that the platform could represent the world as a whole, with the figures being symbolic of the continents upon it, in which case the metaphor becomes slightly more complex and harder to interpret. Ostensibly, balance is a comment upon behaviour and a challenge to human agency, rather than opposing any ruling body. However open-ended the symbolism and metaphor usage renders the narrative. Made in 1982 by the controversial Estonian animator, illustrator and artist Priit Pern, The Triangle depicts the somewhat dreary routine of a couple, Victor and Julia, in their kitchen being interrupted by a small stranger who wishes to steal the food cooked by Julia. At the time of making, Pern had already had considerable issues with the Goskino, the USSR State Committee for Cinematography, and was struggling against the creative oppression set in place by the state. In a risky attempt to get funding for the making of The Triangle, Pern lied to the Goskino, stating that his intention was to create a modern version of the beloved folk tale that the film is loosely based around. Once funding was achieved, Pern forged ahead with a multimodal, metaphorically rich and amusing critique of the Goskino's script control. Throughout the entire film, Julia and Victor only ever utter the other's name, varying in tone and emphasis to hint at the nature of their dialogue. The Soviet-Estonian view of the West, namely as an unattainable, abundant nirvana, and the underlying current of conflict between Russia and Estonia at the time. The final animation that we will examine is not so much a critique of any governing body, as it is a socio-political comment upon the absurdity of war and the cyclic quality of political power games in general. Persian animator and artist Ali Akbar Sadegi's The Rook, made in 1974, addresses these themes through the use of a chess game, employing humorously elaborate advances. For example, some of the characters seemingly devour the opposition, and the trumpeting elephants appear to glorify the aggressive movements. The fact that Iran was on the verge of a rebellion, and that tension had been steadily growing between the United States and the Iranian government, only serves to give these gestures a more powerful and metaphorically fecund interpretation. From our dreams whilst we sleep, or the adverts on the side of our cereal boxes, through to our understanding and interpretation of concepts, even penetrating our latent behavioural patterns, metaphor is our unconscious storyteller. The scientific and creative methodologies of translating trope, although at times conflicting, ultimately suggest that metaphor comprehension has evolved into a deeply intuitive exercise. Research has shown that metaphor is used daily, using proven techniques that manipulate our senses or play on our inherent cognitive synesthesia, attempting to shape our behaviour or bring certain topics to the forefront of our awareness, sometimes extremely creatively. This seems to be celebrated and encouraged throughout scientific and media experiments where consumerism or strategies of political persuasion are perfected. However, when this understanding of our basic human condition is used to challenge certain ideologies, it can lead to dire consequences for the artist. Why could this be? Perhaps it is purely regarding power. Certain totalitarian governments have attempted to permit no individual freedom, seeking to subordinate every area of a person's life to the authority of said government, creating the need for artists who wish to oppose these regimes to smuggle meaning into their work in order to challenge unfair or greedy regulations. When an entire organization seems to be centered around mute compliance to rules that are founded upon childish systems of squeamishness and offense, where a cartoon depiction of an authority figure created by a member of the public with little or no political standing can lead to brutality and the loss of freedom, one must ask oneself, what is the basis for such fear? Is the knowledge of the power of the metaphor something that is limited only to corporations or governments wishing to use it as a tool for manipulation, attempting to keep the population trapped in a circle of taciturn conformity and unconscious consumerism? Perhaps we can never fully answer these questions, but it is a mark of the open society within which we live that I am even capable of asking them without consequence. Thankfully, most who live in the West are now under a democratic system whereby freedom of speech is encouraged and voting is commonplace when choosing a leader. Thus, artists, illustrators, poets and animators alike have created beautiful and haunting pieces, challenging cultural norms and our obedience to certain principles set in place by ruling bodies. Due to internet globalization, knowledge is now widely available, causing creative individuals to more frequently question ideologies concerning sustainability, tyrannical governments and human rights, seeking worldwide change through group organizations that petition, poll and rally. Many have decided to shun the 1950s post-war criterion for what was formerly promoted as a domestic ideology, living off the grid in tiny, hand-built eco-homes and choosing to forego the cultural expectation of working in 9-to-5 employment. Indeed, through this research and the knowledge that has been obtained regarding the power of metaphor, my own practice has come under scrutiny, bringing with it the realization that it would be a wise decision to pay more attention to this tool in order to inspire creativity and even perhaps change perspectives within others, gratefully utilizing my freedom of expression without the fear of brutal retribution.